Welcome to JS on Politics. I'm your host, Greg Borowski. Well, when the circus comes to town, it's always a lot of fun, but then there's always some cleanup to do, and that's where today's show comes in. Here's a look at what's ahead on a very full agenda for us today. After two underdog victories here, the presidential candidates are headed to New York. We'll take a look at what's ahead. We'll dig into the results of the state Supreme Court race and the Milwaukee County executive race, where incumbents won both. And Mayor Tom Barrett also won a new term. Does a mandate come with it? We'll talk also about the winners and losers from Tuesday, and as always, we'll take some reader questions, so please send those in. But we'll start today's program with a taped segment that looks at the next steps and the next stops on the presidential campaign trail. We're joined now by Craig Gilbert, our Washington Bureau Chief, to talk more about presidential results from Tuesday. So we've waited a long time for Wisconsin to be a very consequential state in the primary calendar. It was, and it actually will make the next states even more consequential, potentially. So what kind of momentum are Bernie Sanders and Ted Cruz taking out of this election?
Well, I think it does help them, but you know how there's a saying in baseball that momentum is only as good as your next day's starting pitcher, and in the nominating season, momentum is only as good as the next state. And the next state is a very different state than Wisconsin. So New York, I think, is a much better state for Donald Trump than Wisconsin was. It's probably a better state, or is a better state for Hillary Clinton, but it's, you know, Bernie Sanders is a New York native, and so that race has been more volatile on the Democratic side. But psychologically, it's a boost. Obviously, it prolongs the race. It emboldens, on the Republican side, it emboldens the Stop Trump movement. There's no doubt about it.
All right, let's take a quick look at the next states on the calendar. So we've got Wyoming caucuses for the Democrats coming up on the 9th, but really New York is the big player, and then a week later, Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and then back to the Midwest and Indiana. So when you look at that mix of states, not just New York, it's a very Eastern flavor. Who does that seem to benefit on each side?
Well, I think on the Republican side, the Northeast is better for Donald Trump than the upper Midwest. I don't think there's any doubt about that. He did really well in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. One of the wild cards, though, is John Kasich, who's still in the race, much to the chagrin of Ted Cruz.
He's hoping for more success out there.
And he sees the Northeast as a place where he can do well with the kind of big moderate voting bloc. And he's, you know, Donald Trump also appeals to moderates, but I think they appeal to very different kinds of moderates. So the Kasich is a wild card because what Kasich does really matters to Ted Cruz's share of the vote. On the Democratic side, I think it's kind of a free-for-all. I mean, Hillary Clinton has been ahead in the polling, but Bernie Sanders is gaining in some of these states. It's going to be kind of state by state, closed primary, open primary is a big deal. Open primaries are better for Bernie Sanders. Some of these primaries are closed, which is not as good for him.
All right, let's look at the delegate race, which of course is what really matters at this stage. And on the Democratic side, Hillary Clinton still has her large lead, 1,743 delegates to Bernie's, 1,056, and that's, including the superdelegates, she needs another 640 or so. And then let's look at the Republican side, where Trump, still is ahead, but the question is, can he make it to the threshold and get the nomination outright?
So the math is better for Hillary Clinton than it is for Donald Trump, and one reason we saw in Wisconsin with proportionality, how difficult it is to make delegate gains. Bernie Sanders had this sweeping victory, right? And out of 86 pledged delegates, he probably comes out with a net gain of 10, 48-38, but then that's going to come down a little bit because she has more super delegates than he has. So not a big move on the delegate side. For Republicans, there can be big swings because there's more winner take all, but Donald Trump, that is an opportunity for the Stop Trump people, because in a state like Wisconsin, when they win, they can deny Trump the he only got 6 delegates here out of 42. But if Trump comes into a state like New York and wins big, that's great for his math.
All right, let's look at the other factor that New York is 2 weeks off, just as Wisconsin had featured this sort of mini campaign. The candidates were here a lot. They'll have the same opportunity in New York. How does that change the flavor of things? Does that help or favor one or the other in terms of?
Well, I don't know if it favors one candidate or another. I think the Sanders people have been saying all along they think they do better when they can go in and focus on one state and kind of duke it out. But I think it just depends on the circumstances. In Wisconsin, we saw a kind of a weird confluence of local and national politics in play. Lots of big controversies when Donald Trump came in, abortion, his campaign manager was charged, but then all this stuff going on at the local level. So in New York, I think we're going to see something similar. There will be New York issues and New York dynamics that have an impact on both sides.
All right, and last, let's look at the turnouts. We had record numbers or near record numbers in Wisconsin on Tuesday. What does that portend for the fall here in our state? Is this
and political participation is alive and well in Wisconsin. It never disappoints. I mean, every time you think people might be burned out on politics, they tell us and show us otherwise. This is a state that's been charged up like mad in recent years, and I think we're going to continue to see off-the-charts participation, engagement, voting, participation in politics going forward.
All right, we'll leave our discussion there, and thanks for joining us, Craig. All right, we're back live now and joined by Christian Schneider, one of our editorial page columnists, and we're going to turn now to the state Supreme Court race, which had Justice Rebecca Bradley topping challenger Judge Joanne Kloppenburg. Now, if this were a ordinary year, that would be the headline event from Tuesday, but it's not. This is in the undercard. But let's start before we get into the questions with this little bit of video from Justice Bradley's acceptance or victory speech the other night.
And I also want to tell all of the voters in Wisconsin who supported Judge Kloppenburg, please know that I am your justice too. Everything I said on the campaign trail, I mean sincerely. I will always follow the law, regardless of how I feel about it or the outcome in the case. And I will always support and defend the Constitution. That's my other bracelet tonight. My final word is a big thank you to all of you and to everyone in Wisconsin. And I'm going to end, I think, as I began, with a quote from Churchill. There is nothing more exhilarating than being shot at without result.
All right, so Christian, she was shot at, of course. We all know what some of those bullets were. It wasn't the friendliest of campaigns. What was Justice Bradley's, what was key to her success, do you think, to get this win?
They not only shot bullets at her, they had the full fleet out there raining cannon fire on her. I think it's just mostly just kind of a demographic thing here in Wisconsin. It seems like in the kind of quote-unquote law and order seats where you have Attorney General and Supreme Court justices tend to tip more towards conservatives. It's just kind of the way it is. And of course now we run Supreme Court races as if they are law and order, lock people up and that type of thing. And
they don't really handle the average shooting case, right?
Right.
I mean,
it's very little of what they actually do, but it's kind of the way conservatives have figured out that they can get elected now, and that's why they now hold a 5-2 majority on the court. So it's going to be conservative for a long time, and you had a lot of the a lot of these groups. Like One Wisconsin Now came out. They looked at her old record, her old columns, found a lot of that stuff. Had a big press conference. This is outrageous. How dare she do this? But in the presidential race, you saw a lot about, Wisconsin nice and that type of stuff. People seem to be pretty forgiving about that, I think. Well,
she seemed to also sort of use it to her advantage, or certainly was trying to, by saying, like, they're attacking me, it's old news. I mean, do you think that garnered some sort of people saying, well, we're going to either get inspired to help keep her in office, or were sympathetic to her situation and may have, given a greater hearing and attention to it?
Yeah, for her supporters, it definitely probably woke them up and said, "Oh, wait a minute, this is really serious now. We could actually lose this seat." So in that sense, it may have energized them. But in terms of it was the custody case and kind of the affair story, I think that really kicked things into high gear, where she thought that the Journal Sentinel ran a story that was unfair to her. And that's when talk radio got ginned up and everybody started working in her favor. So that was part two. It seemed like for a couple of weeks there was almost a story a day, and I know actually some of her opponents probably planned it that way, kind of parsing them out. But in the end, voters statewide took a look and said, we're kind of more interested in what kind of judge she's going to be, other than what she said, when she was 21 years old.
Let's look at the other side, which was Joanne Kloppenburg, who's run for this job before and actually seemed to fare better that time than this time. So what was the difference there?
I don't know. It's just that, something about second acts in Wisconsin politics. They kind of knew her name. I knew at the beginning one of the talking points was, well, they're going to tie her to Scott Walker, tie Bradley to Scott Walker, who's not very popular. Well, Walker wasn't very popular kind of right during the heart of all the Act 10
probably
protests.
Equally unpopular, it seemed like.
Yes,
at that time.
and even more, virulently unpopular at the time, and yet Kloppenburg still couldn't knock off David Prosser at the time. So my argument all along was, if you can't beat a conservative at that point, when are you ever going to do it? And like I said, given the attacks that Bradley underwent and the people kind of rallying behind her, it wasn't really as politically charged of an environment this time, and so it kind of defaulted to where I think we are, just kind of naturally in races.
All right, let's just look real quickly at two local races at the Milwaukee County level, where two judges that were appointed last fall by Scott Walker both lost, one narrowly and one rather widely. It's sort of following a pattern of the governor will appoint to fill a vacancy. In the spring, the voters choose the opposite person. Is it just the demographics of the county, or what's going on there?
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with just kind of Milwaukee itself, the partisan makeup. Bradley is actually one of those who actually kind of broke that cycle and is now on the Supreme Court. But yeah, in the city of Milwaukee, county of Milwaukee, Walker's probably not the most popular guy, so I can see where it would affect those races for sure.
Yeah. All right, well, we're going to continue our journey kind of down the ballot here and go to some of the local elections with this tape segment, starting with the county executive's race. All right, we're joined now by Dan Bice, our Watchdog columnist, Mary Spicuzza, one of our political reporters. They've broken free of all their other commitments on the networks. We have them exclusively today, Andreas on Politics, and we're going to talk about some of the local races. So Dan, let's start with the county executive race, and first just take a look at the numbers, where Chris Abele won with 56% of the vote over challenger Chris Larson, who had actually ran ahead of him in the primary. So what went wrong for Chris Larson?
Well, what was different is in the primary, Chris Abele ran nothing but positive ads and had almost nothing to say about Chris Larson. So he came into the general election largely undefined. 51% of the voters said they had no impression of him whatsoever. Starting with the general election, Abele started pounding him with ads. In fact, he ran all but one negative ads targeting Larson. In addition to that, the amount of money spent, as far as we know so far, it's $3.5 million spent by Abele versus $220,000 spent by Larson. So
there's a massive difference, but Chris Larson did have support from the Workers' Party. I know at my house we got plenty of mailings about Chris Larson, anti-Chris Abele. Do you think it was strictly the money, or were there other factors that you saw at work, Mary?
I think Chris Larson benefited from the Wisconsin Working Families Party spending on his behalf, but he obviously didn't benefit enough. But I think Abele hammering him with negative ads obviously did not help him. I think his spat with Lena Taylor came back to haunt him because she, obviously wanted an apology, demanded an apology. That became, he said it was a private conversation, but it obviously wasn't that private and became a pretty
something
public
that could have
debate.
been a one-day story ended up playing out over almost a week, and I'd heard in the daily tracking polls, which is amazing that there were daily tracking polls, but that there was an impact apparently.
Well, I crunched some numbers. By that I mean I took an envelope and a thing that the presidential candidates in Milwaukee County got about 307,000 votes collectively.
Right.
And in the executive's race, there's 282,000 combined. So there's 25,000 who didn't go there. Were those some Bernie Sanders supporters, do you suppose, or where was that drop off? Could that have potentially benefited Chris Larson?
It might be that, but that's still pretty good because usually the higher you are in the ballot, the more people who are voting. So what is that? It's like 80% of the people who voted in the one race that voted in the other. So I'm sure he benefited from the Bernie Sanders because Bernie Sanders did much better than I expected in Milwaukee County. He ends up with about 48% of the vote. Mm-hmm. And people were saying this is Hillary Clinton country. Well, 48% of the vote is pretty substantial.
All right, let's turn to the mayor's race, and let's look at those numbers first, where Tom Barrett had a really easy victory for him, 70% over 30% for Bob Donovan. And Mary, we looked at some of the past numbers. That's actually a little less than Barrett's got in the past. So he's accustomed to easy re-election wins, but what do you attribute his success to in that race?
I think it was a few things. He obviously outraised and outspent his challenger, Bob Donovan. He was, I think by the beginning of the year, he had $800,000 already in his campaign war chest. He grew that. He started spending more. He had TV ads. He had radio ads. Donovan did 2 radio ads, no TV. The radio ads were really not very sophisticated, and I didn't think very effective. I also think, Tom Barrett's an incumbent. Everybody thinks he's a nice guy. He was out. I think he clearly has a name for himself, and Bob Donovan just wasn't that good of a candidate.
Well, normally with the margin that big, you'd claim, you have this mandate, but it didn't seem like the mayor was running on a particular platform as much as that Bob Donovan's kind of unstable, and by the way, he's got racist kind of tendencies. So what can the mayor take from this and say, now here's what we got to get done?
Well, his ads did focus on that he has helped turn around downtown Milwaukee. That was pretty much his platform, and the Menominee Valley area, that he's done a lot of work there. But it is true the race did tend to focus. This should be a referendum on the mayor, but it ended up being shifted into a referendum on Donovan and all of his flaws, including the amateurish ads, the poor debate performances, his temper tantrum with the Journal Sentinel, and all of these problems piled up on top of each other, and it didn't seem like a real race.
Yeah. So what's your sense? What's the mayor, to take away when he gets to his office the day after election? So here's our mandate to go do what?
At his victory party, we had one of our coworkers was there. He talked about wages and trying to improve wages in the city. Obviously, jobs continues to be an issue. I think he realizes that crime continues to be an issue and is going to be trying to push for that. He's talked about job training programs. So I think that those are some of the things that we'll hear about.
I think the race, even though he wins 70-30, highlights one of his weaknesses, and that is, as we said actually on the show with him here, that he's very defensive in how he approaches government. He tries not to make mistakes, not to push an agenda forward. So I think, even on the Milwaukee Bucks arena, he was not the one taking the lead on it. He was the one trying to make sure that he didn't make any mistakes on that. So does he have an agenda moving forward? We'd hope so, but he hasn't laid out much so far.
All right, let's lastly talk about the Milwaukee Common Council and the move to who will be the Common Council president going forward. There are 3 people who have been, seeking that position, or at least indicated they will. From on your screen from the left, Tony Zielinski. In the middle, Ashanti Hamilton, and on the right, current President Michael Murphy. What are you hearing about the jockeying among the aldermen and the aldermen-to-be?
So I have not heard back. I put out some calls to check in with them this afternoon. I haven't heard back from the 2 that we hear are going to be challenging the current president, Michael Murphy. Michael Murphy said that he is confident he has the votes to be reelected. I think he obviously is probably reaching out to a lot of his colleagues to congratulate them today on their victories and trying to, make nice with everybody. But he's worked well with the mayor. He can say that. He's worked well with the head of finance, Nick Kovac. I think that he is probably going to just make sure that he has the support he needs and will try to win over
his challenge will be Ashanti Hamilton. I think Tony Zielinski's talking about it, but I think Ashanti is the real challenger. He could probably consolidate most of the African American members of the council, and then he'll try to grow that. The thing that probably hurts him is that Craig Peterson, who is running this Milwaukeeans for Better Governance group, did very poorly, and so these people who would have been dissatisfied with Murphy's leadership aren't there.
Yeah, is the fact that even though among those who are left, is it a selling point to say, hey, I get along well with the mayor? There's some notably cantankerous aldermen out there who probably don't want you to get along with the mayor sometimes.
Yeah, and I think Milwaukeeans for Self-Governance were hoping that there would be a president who does not get along with the mayor, who could try to kind of weaken the mayor's influence on the city. That obviously didn't happen with them. They did not win a large amount of seats to really have like a sea change at City Hall. But, I think Alderman Hamilton is also quite popular and works well with people. So I think, he could have a serious challenge. I'd be surprised if Zielinski were to get the president spot, but, I've been surprised
He's
before.
on that cantankerous list.
Yes.
Right,
yeah.
so,
my guess is that he's probably doing this to try to negotiate some sort of deal so he gets a decent committee assignment. That's not unusual.
Deals at City Hall.
Yes.
Imagine that.
You used to cover City Hall. Did they do that back in the day?
That stuff happens all the time. We'll leave that discussion there, and thanks to Dan and Mary for joining us. So that was our look at the local races, and we're going to go right back to the tape to see Dan Bice, who flew solo on this next segment in terms of talking about his winners and losers from Tuesday. I'm Greg Borowski, and we're joined now by Dan Bice, our Watchdog columnist, to talk about winners and losers from Tuesday night's elections. And these aren't necessarily your ordinary winners and losers. We're not just talking about who's ahead in the polls.
I generally try to avoid naming people who are on the ballot because everybody knows who those winners and losers are, unless there's an exceptional situation.
All right, and so here your first winner you have are the incumbents at the local level.
The Milwaukee County and city incumbents. There's all this talk about the anti-incumbency fervor around the country. In fact, here, every incumbent for the Milwaukee County and City was reelected except for Alderman Puente and 2 Walker appointees to the bench. Everybody else, I mean, Tom Barrett ends up getting 70% of the vote, and Chris Abele ends up winning by 12%.
Is that just because it's hard to unseat an incumbent, or was there something about just overblown claims that these challengers were going to do well?
I think in Milwaukee, you had a huge turnout for Hillary Clinton, who is an establishment person. Plus, I think that, we'll touch on this in a minute. Some of the issues just didn't resonate with voters in terms of why we needed to remove the people who were there.
All right. Now, one of your losers is Bob Donovan. We know he lost big in the mayor's race. He did hang on to his aldermanic seat, but why do you have him down as a loser?
He ended up performing worse in the general election in both races, even though he had fewer candidates that he was running against. He got 31% of the vote in the primary against Barrett and Davis. In the primary, he ends up with 30%, which is about as low as you can go for a major candidate in a mayoral race. And in his own aldermanic race, he just barely hung on to that against a political newcomer, and he's walking away with fewer votes than any other person on the Common Council.
All right. On the winner side, you've got Governor Scott Walker, who is not on the ballot, but seemed to be in everybody's election mailer and TV ad.
Yeah, everybody wanted to associate. But the fact is, he came on and he endorsed Ted Cruz. I was told by one of his allies, supporters, insiders, that about 10 days before his endorsement, he was thinking whether it was important or not. But he did endorse, and I think it had an impact. But I think equally important was the attacks that Donald Trump had on him. And last Friday night at the fish fry, in which all the GOP leaders were there, people again and again and again kept on mentioning how upset they were by Donald Trump making these attacks. It wasn't so much that they disagreed with his criticisms. It was more that an outsider was coming in.
And he's our guy.
He is our guy. And we went through Act 10 with him. Yeah. You weren't here. You shouldn't have been. You shouldn't be saying this stuff.
On the loser side, and speaking of the fish fry and other appearances, Sarah Palin, who was as a surrogate for Donald Trump,
which was a complete and utter disaster. It was 19 minutes long. She got applause, I believe, twice. Once she made a mention of the green and gold. I don't count that because anybody who mentions the Packers,
that's just gratuitous,
right? And then she got one applause line in the speech, and then she got an applause line when she thanked the people for letting her to intervene. And it's still actually resonating how bad this speech is. Yesterday on Morning Joe, they were asking if this was a case of, quote, bad acid or whatever. And in fact, I think she knows how bad it was because when she left the stage, NBC asked her how it went, and she basically said, "At least I didn't get booed."
That's a pretty low bar. All right, on your winner list, you've got the Milwaukee streetcar, or as the opponents called it, the Milwaukee trolley.
Which I make a point of that. It's hard to find people who fully embrace the streetcar. The opponents call it a trolley. Mark Belling loses his voice screeching about the thing. Polls show that only about a third of Milwaukee city residents support it, but the candidates who made this their key issue didn't do so well. And in particular, Chris Wyken, who was taking on Terry Witkowski, he made it a big issue for him, and he ends up with only 47% of the vote, ends up losing.
And finally, let's get one more of your losers, Craig Peterson, who was part of this shadowy behind-the-scenes group trying to influence city and local elections. How did he do with his candidates?
He's the River Hills Republican consultant who's leading the group called Milwaukeeans for Better Governance. I believe all of his challengers ended up losing. He had a couple of incumbency supporters, including Mark Borkowski, who won. He told me last night that he had a couple other candidates that we didn't know about that actually did really well.
So these are the double secret probation candidates.
But that's the problem with his organization right now. So much of it's secret, we don't know exactly what's happening.
All right, so you can read more about Dan's winners and loser picks at jsonline.com. All right, we're back live for some more winners and losers with a couple of winners here. Christian Schneider here on my right, who was here earlier, and James Causey here on my left. So, James, let me ask you first. Who's your winner from the election?
Well, I want to put it this way. Big winners are coming out in record numbers, too, and some standing in line for up to 2 hours to cast their vote. I would say Wisconsin voters were big winners. Biggest turnout since 1972.
All right, your winner.
My winner is
Christian?
Winston Churchill. He was quoted by both Ted Cruz and Rebecca Bradley within minutes. But no, I'm kind of going to go off the board. I think Ron Johnson, weirdly, is a big winner, even though he wasn't on any ballot. I'm adhering to the Bice rule, nobody on the ballot. Because if you look at the Marquette poll, which in this election turned out to be pretty darn accurate, Ron Johnson has a 3-point race on his hands, and that is far closer than the 10-point race or double-digit race that we had seen before. So, given the election outcome and given that poll, I think it might be a little closer than we think.
Yeah, let me ask you this before we get to the losers. Is there any concern for the Democrats? If you looked at who voted in which primary, the Republicans came out ahead, and there's been that's been following that pattern across the country. Are the Republicans more energized? James, what do you think?
I think the Democrats have a lot of work to do. I think voter ID played a role, and we have a lot of work to do on the Democratic side. I think a lot of people get more energized come time for the next election, and it's going to be interesting.
Let's go to Christian for your loser from Tuesday.
My loser are the voter ID opponents. I got to say, for years we've been hearing, this is a tool of suppression. This is to keep people away from the polls, and yet 700,000 more people voted on Tuesday than in the last two-party contested election in 2008. So if it's a vote suppression tool, it's the worst one there possibly is. And now the goalposts are moving. Well, there were lots of lines, a lot of people registering, but a lot of people were registering at the time, and that's just going to be the case anytime you have a big turnout.
That's why I wondered because a lot of these were on campuses, so there's a lot of young people who may not have been registered. Did you get the sense, James, that these are lines that caused by the photo ID or by registration and just
I think it was a combination of both. I mean, I saw one of the news stations, they had a kid who waited in line almost 2 hours, had to get out when he got a chance to vote. He didn't have to write paperwork, so he had to go to class. Then he came back for another 2 hours, waited in line just to cast his ballot. So I think it was a combination of both. But when we want to talk about losers and you talk about voter ID.
Give us your loser here.
Well,
I'm setting you up on this one, James.
I know. You're talking about 700,000 voters, right? It could have been 800,000 had we not had voter ID in place, maybe. I think the number would have been higher. So my biggest loser is Glenn Grothman, who pretty much admitted to the world that, voter ID helped the Republican Party this time around.
Do you think that's what's your take on Glenn Grothman's statement? It's gotten a lot of national attention and others. It's the kind that keeps on giving. People are keep coming back and citing that for a while.
Right. I thought, when Glenn Grothman was first elected, I thought, Gawker is going to build a whole new building just based on the things that he says, and of course this is one of them. I'm not in the habit of getting into his head, but I would think that he thinks that there's a lot of vote fraud out there, and that it's committed by Democrats, and so by doing, with voter ID, you're not going to have as much. You can argue about how much vote fraud there actually is, but I would think that that's kind of what he had on his mind. And I would think the vote disparity that you saw is more Republicans' fear of Donald Trump than you see, of anything having to do with voter ID. I mean, they were scared of Trump. This is the one place where conservatives put their foot down and said we're going to stop him, and I think that motivated Republicans to get out.
All right, let's try to squeeze in two quick reader questions. And the first one I'm going to ask you, James, this is from Carol, who says, just thinking back to Tuesday night, how can they say Cruz won in Wisconsin when people were still voting? And she said she's thinking our votes really don't count or the elections are crooked. What was your sense
that was one of my biggest problems with Tuesday night. Cruz was giving his, polls closed at 8. At 8:48, Cruz was giving his victory speech, and there were still people waiting in line to cast their ballot. that just doesn't seem right to me with 21% of the vote in, with the race being called.
Yeah, and of course they're operating on exit polls
Right.
and turnout, and
These are private
Cruz isn't
media-
really talking to the Wisconsin voters on Tuesday night. He's talking to the New York voters.
Right. These are private media organizations, so they're not, really constrained by any rules. They see exit polling, they see kind of the results coming in and make their determination based on that. Now, exit polling oftentimes turns out to be really wrong. I've seen, many cases of races called on exit polling when it wasn't the case.
But the point of the matter is that you're waiting in line. Why would you
The
cast your
question is
ballot?
why some people might leave
Right, if a race
or
is
not
already
fill
over.
out the lower ballots.
Yep.
That gets to this other question. I'll throw this one to you, Christian, first. This is from Bill, who asks, he says, Bernie Sanders voters didn't fill out the whole ballot. So there's some indication they didn't follow through all the way down. Is he a team player for the Democrats, or does he only worry about himself?
I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, Bernie Sanders, almost in his entire life, has been an independent. He hasn't been a Democrat, so he doesn't have a lot of the same infrastructure that a Democrat would naturally have. And so, there may be a problem. I mean, you always see a drop off from race to race to race. I think 200,000 fewer people voted in the Supreme Court race than voted in the presidential races. So there's always naturally some of that. But I mean, Sanders may not have the infrastructure in place that a traditional Democrat might.
Yeah. Well, you just to ask James before we wrap up. I mean, I know some of the Chris Larson literature, for instance. He was saying, whoever you're voting for, come out, vote for the real Democrat. He was trying to harness some of that support. Was that a missed opportunity for some of these other candidates to get the message out to the new Bernie voters?
Yeah, I think so. But I got so much mail, probably like most of us. Most of it, as soon as I got it, I just tossed it in the garbage can. It was a ton of leaflets that came out, but it was a lot of missed opportunities there for to support a straight Democratic ticket.
All right, so we'll leave our discussion there for today. We went over a little bit, but that's because we had so much good material from these guys and others. A reminder, you can follow our work at jsonline.com/politics. You can follow our hashtag, which is JSPolitics, and you can also tune in next Thursday at the same time and the same computer to watch our show next week. Thank you.